we go. Good afternoon. I'm Juliane Kempfield. I'm the director of Deutsches Haus at NYU, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our second day in our conference, Germany, an Inventory of the Now. And this is the last panel of the conference, and the panel is, of course, a look ahead: Germany after Angela Merkel, if you can imagine a Germany after Angela Merkel, but that's a question we will, of course, discuss. And we are absolutely delighted to have Christine Landfried, Joyce Mushaben, Boris Vormann, and Stephen Sokol, who will moderate here to discuss the future, so to speak. Well, they'll all be Cassandra, but hopefully with a better outcome than hers. We're also very delighted that David Gill, the German Consul General in New York, has agreed to provide us with a Grußwort, some opening remarks. And after I will introduce our panelists, he will take over, provide the Grußwort, and then hand things over to Steve Sokol, our moderator. The bioinformation for our panelists will be drastically shortened, but you will be able to read in more detail about them through our chat function, and my colleague Sarah will provide the information about all their accomplishments in the chat. What else? Thanks. A big thanks, of course, goes to all of our speakers, to David Gill. Thank you for being here today. And thank you to Sarah and Adriana and Nicole for all your great work on the conference. Thanks also goes to the DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service, for their continued and wonderful support of our academically inclined programs. And thank you, the audience, for making time during this busy holiday time to be here with us and look into the future of Germany and the transatlantic relationship. So our panel of political scientists and thinkers will consider what Germany's political future might look like in the absence of Angela Merkel, and which political coalitions the election results next September might bring. How will the country move forward? Who might Germany's next chancellor be? What does this mean for Europe and the US? And now I'll read the short bio info for our distinguished panelists. So that will be quick. Christine Landfried is Professor Emerita of Political Science at the University of Hamburg. She is chairing the advisory board of the Social Science Research Center Berlin, BZB, and next year she will work as a Thomas Mann Fellow on a project about new forms of citizens' participation in representative democracies. Joyce Mushaben is a Curator's Distinguished Professor of Comparative Politics Emerita at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. She is now an adjunct faculty member in the BMW Center for German and European Studies at Georgetown University and works with Gender 5+, an EU feminist think tank. Her many publications include Becoming Madame Chancellor Angela Merkel and the Berlin Republic, and her current book in progress centers on the dialectical identities excuse me, of Eastern Germans, reassessing the forces of exit, voice, and loyalty. Then we have Steve Sokol, our moderator. He is president of the American Council on Germany. He has more than 25 years of experience working on domestic and foreign policy issues with nonprofit organizations in Europe and the United States. And now we're moving on to Boris Vormann, who is a professor of politics and director of the politics section at Bard College, Berlin. His most recent books are Democracy in Crisis, The Neoliberal Roots of Popular Unrest, and Contours of the Liberal State. I should mention that all of these wonderful speakers have been friends of Deutsches Haus at NYU for a long, long time, and I'm so delighted to have this little reunion with friends and experts, and thank you so much for making this happen. And very last but not least, I promise, I just want to mention that we have another conference coming up, 4 events next week about the theory of the alt-right which we are co-presenting with the German department and the IPK. And our last event this year will be a literary event that we are organizing together with the Consul General of Germany and in collaboration with the Festival Neue Literatur partners, bringing together Austrian, Swiss, German, and US writers. To be specific, Jonas Lüscher, Andrea Grill, Monique Truong, Sascha Salzmann, and Tess Lewis. So save the date. And now it is my great pleasure to hand things over to David Gill. David, take it away. Thank you.
Danke, Juliane. Und guten Tag, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, liebe Freunde, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Just a few weeks after my younger daughter was born in Berlin, the then chairwoman of the CDU took over the office of the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany from Gerhard Schröder. She was the first woman and the first from East Germany who holds this office. My daughter is now a sophomore in high school here in New York, and Angela Merkel is still our Chancellor. What a legacy. And so the title of this afternoon's discussion, A Look Ahead, Germany after Angela Merkel, goes further than the usual question before a regular election. Indeed, obviously, we Germans like stability and durability, not only during the governance of Angela Merkel. In the more than 70 years of its existence, the Federal Republic of Germany has seen only 9 chancellors. Compared, for instance, with Italy, admittedly a rather extreme example, with 29 different prime ministers in over 50 governments. By the way, no woman. But even Great Britain had seen 15 different persons in this office during the same time period. And since arriving here in New York 3 years ago, I often hear from Americans tell me that they envy us for the stability as well as for the person who symbolizes it. But when we look closer, we can see that the last 15 years were not just a continuum of a politician, nor were they a continuum of policies. Angela Merkel governed in different coalitions. She had ups and downs, times of great popularity and times of disapproval by the public in her own country, in Europe, worldwide, and even in her own party. Particularly interesting was to see that sometimes policies that she pursued were met with enthusiasm, only to be denigrated later when circumstances had changed. Yes, the election next year will be different from the last elections in Germany. An incumbent will not return, no question. But not everything will change. And it will definitely not be the end of democracy in Germany, as I was half jokingly asked 2 years ago when Merkel announced that she will step down as chairwoman of the CDU and won't run again for chancellor. I'm personally not worried for the democracy in my country. We have managed many changes in the last decades and the institutions are strong. Yes, there are many challenges for our society in general and politics in particular. The cohesion of the society, climate change and migration, the rise of populism and extremism, or the division between cities and rural regions, to name just a few. But I'm certain that there are many people who are willing and able to take responsibility for their country, as they did and do on the different levels, from the municipalities and counties to the Länder, and finally, the federal level. That is the great asset of a republic. And some of those people might even be mentioned in the discussion this afternoon. Nonetheless, I respectfully predict all of us will miss Chancellor Merkel in at least one of her many roles. Either way, we will certainly feel her absence. And my daughter's generation will have to get used to another name following the title Chancellor. I'm looking forward to a lively and inspiring discussion, and I hand over now to the President of the American Consul in Germany, my friend Steve Sokol.
Dear Consul General Gill, lieber David, thank you so much for your personal reminder that there's a generation of Germans who do not remember a time before Chancellor Merkel. And thank you for setting the stage for the final panel of this interesting conference organized by Deutsches Haus at NYU. As you said, David, there's been an ebb and a flow in the popularity of Angela Merkel, but stability has prevailed. And I am sure that we will touch on many of the topics that you raised in your short introduction during our discussion. Liebe Juliane, thank you for inviting me to moderate this panel. I am delighted to do so. We are all dealing with a lot of uncertainty right now. Amidst this uncertainty, one thing is clear. After 4 terms as Germany's chancellor, Angela Merkel will not run for a 5th term. After 16 years in office, she will step down. But this raises many questions, some of which were posed by Juliane at the outset, but there are others. What will Germany look like after Chancellor Merkel? What is her legacy? What will happen within her party, the Christian Democratic Union? How will Germany's political landscape evolve? And what does all this mean for Germany, for Europe, and the transatlantic relationship? Deutsches Haus at NYU has assembled an excellent panel to help us address these questions. Each of our panelists will make short opening statements, and then we'll engage in a conversation. I will fold viewer questions into the discussion, so please use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask your question, and please let me know if it is directed to the panel as a whole or to a specific speaker. Joyce Mushaben, we're going to start with you. As Juliane mentioned, you've written a lot about Angela Merkel. You published a book titled Becoming Madam Chancellor, Angela Merkel and the Berlin Republic. In it, you argue that since coming into office in 2005, Angela Merkel has had a transformative impact on German society and more broadly. As you reflect on the end of an era, what is the legacy of Angela Merkel's time in office?
Thank all of you for the kind introductions and the invitation to participate in this today. Let me start out by saying I'm a political scientist, and I first met Angela Merkel, actually the only time I've had a longer exchange with her, in 1990, right after she had become the deputy press speaker for Lothar de Maizière, whose job it was to dissolve the GDR, essentially. And then I kind of look back and I realized that she was a nobody from a no place in June of 1990, and I was a nobody from a no place, and she's grown up to be the world's most powerful woman 11 times over. And that has often made me wonder what went wrong with my own career plan. But in any case, when I start talking about her now in terms of legacy, I no longer feel like a political scientist. I feel more like a social historian, because I think we can only appreciate the transformative, truly transformative nature of her years in power by looking back and reminding ourselves where Germany was and what Germany was like in the 1980s and the 1990s, which I experienced personally. I've spent many years living and researching in Germany. So we can't really judge where Germany's going to go until we figured out where it's come from. And in that sense, I think that no matter how the race to replace her ends, Merkel's 16 years in power have indeed provided a transformative response to the question, who is fit to rule Germany? If you recall, as soon as she was elected in 2005, they started suggesting her first grand coalition would not last. When she was reelected in 2009, the chaos of the CDU-FDP government, people kept saying, oh, this one's not going to last. When she was reelected in 2013, Stefan Cornelius, a journalist in Germany, had written, oh, I'm sure Merkel will retire in 2016 because she will be 60 years old, and we all know that women tend to wear out. And then when she was, now that she's approaching the end, people are already talking about her like she's a lame duck, but she still has about 9 months, 10 months to go. So she could be called in to solve or resolve or address yet another crisis waiting around the bend. But let me start then with this first part of her legacy: who is fit to rule Germany? Nobody can ever again ask if a woman has what it takes to run Europe's largest, most powerful economy. But it doesn't stop there. Angela Merkel has also brought many more women into the executive branch per se. She's very proud of the fact, as she announced on the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in Germany, that 50% of all the department heads in the federal chancellor's office are now women. She has brought in people like von der Leyen, who has moved on to become the EU's first female commission president. She has brought in Karrenbauer, and even though she's proved less effective as a party leader, we have to just sort of marvel at the fact that the CDU, as of 2018, was dominated by 3 women. So that is one of the legacies I think that we need to appreciate. A second takeaway, given Merkel's own experiences, as well as those of von der Leyen, is that women will no longer have to pursue the traditional male norm path to power, what Germans call the Ochsentour, the so-called ox tour, where you have to start out early on in your career by hanging up election posters and going door to door and handing out leaflets and standing in the marketplace. In fact, the one woman who went through that Ochsentour, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, has proved to be the least effective of those 3 CDU women. And I also think the Ochsentour, the traditional method of teaching people how to be a party member and how they should respond to certain issues, is losing its currency in the digital and the virtual age. A third legacy that will come out of these 16 years of Merkel at the helm relates to substantive policy outcomes. Merkel and her allies have fundamentally transformed, reconfigured the German gender regime. In part, they've done this by realizing that equality policies are no longer the exclusive domain of national politicians. Both Merkel and von der Leyen have used EU directives and EU mandates to leverage a lot of policy changes in Germany. Think about the reconciliation of work and family, the broad guarantees now for subsidized childcare for infants as well as for toddlers. Think about the parental leave / paternal leave, the obligation or the opportunity for men to be part of family responsibilities, the extended leave options. Think about the corporate quotas, which Merkel herself originally rejected when von der Leyen pounded on the table and said we need 40%. And yet by 2014, Merkel was willing to accept a 30% quota, and that has recently been expanded. So these policies, these gender policies, have brought new stakeholders to the table, and they've also given, I think, men many more opportunities. That leads us then to a fourth rather surprising transformation, namely Merkel's successful modernization of the CDU itself as a party. This was the party that supported Kinder, Küche, Kirche roles, church, kitchen, and children roles for women. And yet the CDU nowadays wouldn't dare to return to those policies, never mind what Merz may have to say on the subject, because it is the daughters and the wives and the sisters of the CDU hardliners who appreciate many of these changes, as is also true of members of the Bundeswehr, some of the things that von der Leyen introduced when she was defense minister. I think it's also quite telling that von der Leyen in the EU launched a new comprehensive gender equality strategy for 2025. And by July 2020, the Federal Republic itself had adopted an interministerial equal treatment strategy that will extend across multiple legislative terms. A fifth component of the so-called Merkel method, I believe, is the recognition among all German politicians that complex national and international problems require longer-term holistic solutions. And that is very clear when we talk about climate change, where von der Leyen and Merkel have always been very interested in bringing more women into MINT fields, or what we call STEM fields. And then a final element of her legacy, to which my colleagues will be able to speak, is that Merkel has moved Germany from the regional stage onto the global stage. She is recognized as an international leader and not just as someone operating within the framework of the EU. Now, another element that I think is harder to perceive, she has in part also solved the demographic problem, because all of these changes in gender policies, the leave policies, the extended policies for men as well as for women, have contributed to Germany's first baby boom since 1964. Her proactive integration policies, not just migration policies, but the national integration plan that she first introduced in 2007. I think Merkel, when she was looking at the refugee crisis in 2015, had a thought in the back of her head, seeing these Syrian families with children holding both hands and fathers with babies over their shoulders, sort of saying to herself, hot dog, I have 11 years to teach them German and engineering. So through these two policy changes, she is helping to alleviate some of the problem of skilled labor shortages. But the final thought I want to leave us with is Merkel's declaration back in May of 2005. Quote, it's not about parties, it's not about careers, it's about something else. Germany can do this, and together we can do this. And this motto, wir schaffen das, we can do this, was an element of the Western mentality. This can-do spirit was also sorely lacking in the eastern part of Germany prior to unification. And I think this theme, Germany, we can do this, we can master these problems, is really something that she has left behind for younger generations. Well, that kind of leads me to my very final thought. If I look at the combined influences of Angela Merkel together with Ursula von der Leyen, and I'll even throw Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer into this mix here, is that despite their somewhat different types and degrees of success as CDU leaders, all of their biographies are a testimony to the wisdom of Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Thank you.
Joyce, thank you. You have touched on a number of topics, which I hope we will circle back to during the course of our conversation. I'd maybe like to pose a question to you that was sort of posed by David Gill in his opening remarks, which is, what do you think we will miss when Merkel leaves office?
First and foremost, we will miss her calm demeanor, her ability to speak to people in simple language that they can understand, her very pragmatic, non-ideological approach to a lot of problems, and the fact that as a former trained physicist, she was inclined to sort of think through problems before she let people know what it was she had decided. Now, sometimes that worked extremely well. I would argue in the case of the Euro crisis, it was a bit more problematic because financial markets respond to psychology. They don't want to wait for a solution. But I think it's her calmness and her ability to sort of disaggregate problems and then to present people with something as if she has a solution to the problem. And that's why her popularity has risen again in terms of the COVID-19, because she has at least the rudiments of a plan, and she can get people to participate in the solution to that problem. So I think they will miss her calm crisis or poker face demeanor and her pragmatic approach.
Indeed, and according to a very recent survey that was conducted by the Pew Research Center, confidence in Angela Merkel is at an all-time high, both in Germany, but also internationally as well. In her 15 years as chancellor, Angela Merkel has worked with 3 US presidents, 4 French presidents, and 5 British prime ministers. The big question is, what next? Christine Landfried, even the casual observer will know that there is a race on to see who will succeed Angela Merkel as the head of the Christian Democratic Party and as Kanzlerkandidat. After an attempt to position Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, the current defense minister, in this role, it's down to 3 rivaling candidates: Armin Laschet, Friedrich Merz, and Norbert Roettgen, all of whom, interestingly enough, come from North Rhine-Westphalia. Can you talk a little bit about each of these 3 candidates and what they might bring to the CDU, or how their selection might change the CDU?
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen. Let me start with first thanking for the invitation by Juliane to Deutsches Haus again. I've cooperated with many conferences, Sarah Girner, Juliane Kempfield, and myself at Deutsches Haus, and it's a pleasure to come back, even if it's only online. Thanks a lot, and dear colleagues and dear guests at Deutsches Haus listening to this debate. When I want to answer Stephen's question, where will it go and what do these 3 candidates now in discussion for being followers of Angela Merkel, what do they represent, what does it mean? I think it is very important for answering this question what Joyce has said, that the era of Angela Merkel was really a transformation. I think it's important to realize how great, how important, what a transformation this was. And I think one of the points which really shows this, it was not just about gender politics, bringing women to politics, enabling much better family and professional life, but also to show that if there is not only one woman in politics in a position, but many, that now women don't have to behave like men, that they show that there is a diversity in approaching problems, in doing things. What Joyce at the end very well said, the calmness of these talks, the thinking be first, then talking about a position. So I think it's important, if we look to the future now and to the coming candidates, to have this in mind. This was really a change in Germany, from coming from a woman party leader and from a chancellor in a party where we never expected this. You must, the CDU is the conservative party. So perhaps we would have expected this from the Social Democrats, but this didn't happen from the Social Democrats. So this is interesting. And insofar, I think it's an important change. It will depend a lot who will follow Angela Merkel, because we all know persons make a difference, but it's not only about these 3 persons. They are combined with certain programs, but even more with directions. So if we take the 3 and if we start with the candidate who has so far from the surveys the most chances to become her follower, and also the candidate for the chancellery, this is Friedrich Merz. And Friedrich Merz, this will be a very different direction than what Angela Merkel has done. So modernization and liberalization and equality between men and women in professional life, these are not his main points. So the CDU in Germany, if he would become a chancellor, would really go again to be much more traditional. This would not mean international or on the European level. I think here there is sort of he would not change so much. But I think with these politics, which were a modernization for Germany, he will go in a much more conservative direction, much more in favor of the economy. He is not very fond of gender equality. Well, he is, of course, he would never say in public, I'm against gender equality. But if you listen to his speeches, so you can see that this would not be a push forward. He would sort of stabilize this. He can't push it really back, but you know, all the pandemic has meant for women that they had now the biggest thing to handle. They had the most challenges. It's a pushback for women in the pandemic. And if this would be combined with the direction in which Friedrich Merz would lead us, I think this would be really a problem for women in professional life. He isn't for these quota for women in the economy, what we call Aufsichtsrat, in the overviewing gremium, or how do you say in English, the
supervisory committee?
Yes, the supervisory boards. So I think he would be the person who would go in a different direction that Angela Merkel has gone. If we go now at the moment, we always said, well, you know, the race will be between Friedrich Merz and Armin Laschet. But in the meantime, this has changed. So it's in the last weeks, the surveys show quite many percent of people in Germany and also in the party of the CDU would favor Norbert Roettgen. So it's at this moment, it's not sure if it really will be, usually we would say, well, Friedrich Merz or Armin Laschet, and Norbert Roettgen, he's more an outsider. This is not true anymore. So we have really three candidates. So if we take the second, Armin Laschet, he would go more in the direction of Angela Merkel. He has worked a lot with her, and I think the change then would not be so big. So we would see more of a continuity in Germany. I think he would sort of, at the moment in the surveys, he is not, he's just about, there was just a new survey and he only had 12% of the people in Germany were in favor of Armin Laschet. So this is at the moment not sure anymore, but he would be continuity. This would mean continuity not only in gender questions, but also in the regulation of the economy, for example. So he would be also, if you think how, in which direction we will go, what will be important, as our party system and parliament is much more fragmented in the meantime, the important question is what coalition will the CDU work with if it's going on that they have been the strongest party in the parliament? And we all know that the Green Party is very strong at the moment in Germany, so they have more percent than the Social Democrats. So now with Armin Laschet, it's very easy to imagine that there would be a coalition between the Green and the CDU. It would not be imaginable with Friedrich Merz and the Green Party. I think this would be a real problem. I couldn't imagine. There was just a long TV debate and you could see the Green Party and Friedrich Merz, they are like this. They don't like each other. So with Armin Laschet, I could imagine we have a coalition with the Green Party and it would go on this direction of the modernization. With Norbert Roettgen, I think he would have a center with foreign policy. He's an expert of foreign policy. He would sort of really strengthen European politics, but also the others. This would not be so much different, but Norbert Roettgen would put, I think, especially to his experience in foreign policy. So we will see if he really, if this continues, that he has good surveys, and what will be the end. In the end, the members of the party will decide. But Norbert Roettgen will be more in between the two. Laschet will be continuation, and I guess in coalition with the Green Party, while Friedrich Merz will be bringing the CDU more back on the traditional track. And we don't have to forget that many also in the CDU and the party are very much in favor of a traditional track. So Angela Merkel was the modernizer and more liberal politics, but many in the CDU say, well, we are now doing social democratic politics. So I think with Friedrich Merz, there will be the biggest change. I think I leave it here because we will have many chances to discuss in our policies. And I think the important thing is to see the trajectory from what Joyce has said, the transformation, that this transformation could be, well, slowed if we had Friedrich Merz as a chair of the CDU. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. I'd like to ask you maybe two very quick follow-up questions to what you just said before we move on to Boris. The first one comes from a viewer who's curious about whether or not Ursula von der Leyen might leave her post at the European Union level, at the European Commission, to come back to Germany for the chancellorship. Is that something that's being discussed at all in Germany right now?
It is not really discussed, but it's not unimaginable that this would be the case. On the other side, if you ask from my knowledge of what is going on the European level, Ursula von der Leyen is really a passionate European. And what she has done in this short time, again, women are really, if they are in these positions, they are changing the world. The European Union for decades now debates to have a fiscal union. And what they decided in July, and she was very much behind this, also with the Green Deal, but also with the decision that the first time the member states of the European Union will take a lot of money on debt, not having austerity policies anymore, but having a debt and giving most of the money to the countries, the member states, who are worse off than the others. So this fiscal union, which is not yet in the treaties at all, it's always said it's just an exception. I don't think it will be an exception. It's the first step towards a new development at the EU level. And Ursula von der Leyen is so engaged here, and I think she's doing a good job. And, having this European impact, I don't think that she would like to go back. So I would say it's not unimaginable, but not probable.
Thank you. And then I wanted to ask you, you were talking a little bit about how each of these three main candidates for the position at the head of the CDU are faring in public opinion polls. But don't we have to distinguish between those public polls and actually the Stimmung within the CDU? Because at the end of the day, it's that party conference that will elect the new party leader.
You are exactly right, Stephen. This is why I also said this one survey, I said this was a survey in the population, but the decision will be done by the members of the CDU. And here they really strongly favor what you call the Stimmung, the atmosphere is. They favor Friedrich Merz. Here you can see the transformations are always very difficult. They are very slow, and beneath the conservative part of the CDU is very strong. And also the younger generation, they are very much in favor of Friedrich Merz. So these are really sort of strong atmospheres of, well, not now so much change anymore, really making a difference to social democratic politics. And these will be the people who vote. And here, so far, there was also from the Spiegel survey also among the party members. But again, here you see the first is Friedrich Merz. And now Norbert Roettgen is not so far away now from Armin Laschet. So it's not decided. Usually we would always say the party members, they will decide between Armin Laschet and Friedrich Merz. And at the moment, Friedrich Merz is the favorite. So there you can see the conservative part of the CDU is still very strong.
Thank you, Christina. I'm very happy in your remarks that you touched on the Greens, because with Boris Vormann, I'd like to take a step back and look at the broader political landscape in which all of this is playing out. At a webinar that the American Council on Germany hosted earlier today, the former head of the Social Democratic Party, Sigmar Gabriel, actually said that he thinks a black-green coalition between the CDU, CSU, and the Green Party is the most likely scenario moving forward. But of course, a lot can happen between now and September. So Boris, I'd like you to maybe talk a little bit about how the Greens are faring. They've been rising in popularity, and the Social Democrats have been losing traction. Can you talk a little bit about some of these trends?
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen. I will. But first, let me thank also again Juliane and Sarah for putting this together, for inviting me. I'm always glad to be at the Deutsches Haus, and it's exciting to be in this panel and to hear these great contributions. So we were given 5 minutes, and I was also asked to look into the future a little bit. And since looking into the future, thinking about the Green Party in the future, the SPD in the future, it's a bit like playing the lottery. I thought it would make the most sense to give you 5 numbers. For 5 minutes, 5 numbers. So the numbers are 16, 53, 11, 7, and 16. So I guess I should add a little bit of context to this, and I will. The first number is 16, and that's the percentage of the SPD if elections were to be held this Sunday, the famous Sonntagsfrage that is being asked to Germans every week. And so the SPD has relatively low numbers, 5 percentage points under the election outcomes from 2017, which were already seen as a disaster at the time. So the SPD is really in a difficult position. I do agree with Sigmar Gabriel, which I don't very often, but I do agree with him on his prognosis. I think that a black-green coalition is the most likely. What Christine Landfried said is certainly right, that it would be more difficult with Friedrich Merz to get into a coalition, but I think he doesn't have many other options. I don't think anybody wants a great coalition again. And a Rot-Rot-Grüne coalition is also unlikely. So I think he will probably have to swallow that pill if it comes to that. So the SPD is in a very deep identity crisis. It has been for 4 years. And I do think that 4 years in the opposition would give the SPD some time for soul searching. I can talk more in the Q&A about why I think the SPD is in such a difficult spot, but I need to get through the numbers, so I will return to this. So the Black-Green coalition, that's number 2, 53, and that's the percentage, the combined total of the CDU, CSU, and the Green Party right now in the so-called Sonntagsfrage. This number has been much higher a couple of weeks ago. It went down in recent days, but I think it's pretty stable. It's not rock solid, but I think it will hold. The CDU has a commanding lead right now, 35%. It's sort of oscillating between 35 and 38%. And I think it will probably remain stable, even though, again, this is like playing the lottery. It's, as we know from the US elections, many things can happen, and the same is true in Germany, of course, as well. But the majority of Germans do support the way that Merkel has handled the crisis, the corona crisis. Most people are for the measures, 70% in a recent survey. 71% are in favor of vaccinations, of being vaccinated. So if the pandemic subsides in the next year, as people assume it will, and if there is a spontaneous economic recovery as well, I think that will give the CDU a boost no matter who will take over. But the question is obviously who can channel that energy into their own campaign when push comes to shove. For the Green Party, yes, Green Party, Christine Landfried also mentioned this, they're doing very well. Their approval ratings are at about 20%, 18, 19, 20%, so stronger than the SPD. It makes them more progressive propositions. I think it's also more visible in public debates than the SPD right now. They just had a party conference that was very visible. It's more attractive to young people and to the Friday for Future movement, so many of whom will get to vote for the first time next year. So I do think the black-green coalition will most likely win. Now, a flailing SPD with Olaf Scholz as its leader, who is very much in the Schröderian tradition, so a more conservative social democrat, and a strong black-green coalition, I think leaves an important flank open, politically speaking. And the question becomes, who is the party for the working people? And I think this will be a very important question that will occupy us for the years to come. And that brings me to number three, which is 11, and probably you guessed it, that's the percentage of the AfD right now. People have been commenting on how the AfD has not been able to capitalize on the corona crisis, which many people didn't anticipate. This is a lower outcome or a lower poll approval than the outcomes 2017, which were at 12.6%. But we shouldn't forget, the AfD had approval ratings of 17, 18, 19% already a couple of months back. So there is a lot of potential. And I think a lot depends also on the corona crisis, how that moves on, and the potential economic boost that could also be an economic crisis. I mean, when we're looking at the US, whatever plays out here will have effects around the world, also in Germany. So it's a pretty volatile situation. It's less stable than it might look at first glance. Of course, Biden is also a signal that pushes back against the illiberal tendencies of the last 4 or 5 years that we've seen around the world, also in Germany. But I think just getting Trump out of the White House will not be sufficient to undo Trumpism, and many people have discussed this in the US as well. And if the potential black-green coalition doesn't address the root causes of these illiberal tendencies, I fear that there might be a long-term backlash to that. My fourth number is 7, which is the polling number for both the FDP and the Left Party at the moment. They are, both not very strong at the moment, and I don't see a way out for them. I mean, the Left Party should be able to benefit really from the situation and from Olaf Scholz being the Kanzlerkandidat for the SPD, because he does leave the left more open, and but I don't think they're going to be able to benefit from it, also because there are struggles in the party leadership right now. And the FDP and market liberalism, I think, has lost much of its appeal. And the more politically liberal arguments that the FDP has been making do seem to ring somewhat hollow. And this brings me to my final number, which is again 16. And I'm not talking again about the SPD's percentage, but I'm talking obviously about Angela Merkel's number of years in office as she leaves office with the elections. As we heard already, she assumed office in 2005, where US hegemony was still unquestioned. It was a very different world at the time. The EU was still supposed to be the potentially new hegemon. I mean, there were books that people wrote about how the EU was rising and consolidating and integrating. The global financial crisis was still 3 years ahead. Austerity policies were still 5 years ahead. So all this hadn't happened at the time. But we have to say, yes, she was stable, and those who have mocked her at the time have become very silent over time. She's, as we heard, the most popular politician of Germany. Even Barack Obama seems to have fallen in love, as we find out now in the interviews that he's been giving all over the world in the last couple of weeks. She's even been described as the torchbearer of liberal democracy. So no matter, I think, who the candidate will become, they will have to fill very big shoes when they step in. But then again, I think stasis is also not good for democracy. And so Merkel leaving office also opens up chances. I mean, she was perceived by many as a social democrat, and she has been liberalizing the CDU. Maybe a more conservative CDU will take away votes from the right extremist party and will open up some spaces for the SPD to recover. So I think it could also be an important corrective to move beyond the politics of inevitability that Schröder had begun really with his terms in office, and that Merkel to some extent took over. Now, I just want to end on this final note of my concern of the major risk that I see when the Black-Green coalition would take office next year, which is that all type of critique might be brushed off simply as populist, and that the questions of inequality fall by the wayside. I think this is a major problem, that there will be a return to market globalization, maybe in a more green appearance, so a greener version of free market globalization. And I think this would be perceived by many who have been following the AfD as a major threat. The pandemic has hit the poor the most. I don't think that it would be unlikely for a Black-Green coalition to press for austerity policies after all the billions and billions that have been spent. And so I think there is really a risk of the AfD thriving under these conditions. And I think that in this scenario, the SPD will have to gain credibility very fast as the working people's party for the AfD not to take its place. Thanks.
Boris, if you don't mind, let me push you on that a little bit, because I think you brought up some topics that I actually wanted to ask Joyce about before, about things that Merkel and the GroKo, the Große Koalition, the Grand Coalition, got credit for, which some people would argue were more social democratic policies than hardcore Christian democratic policies. You talked about how the Social Democrats have lost traction and are no longer perceived as the party of labor and of the working class. Can you talk a little bit about the situation that Olaf Scholz's SPD is in and what a possible way back could be?
Yeah, I think the long-term crisis is a similar crisis to the one we're seeing in the US, which is a mentality, maybe an ideology of the post-Cold War era, that globalization was both inevitable and ultimately beneficial to all. Both the SPD and CDU sort of hopped on that train. Schröder was the chancellor der Bosse, right, and was very close to the businesses, and was making a cosmopolitan claim in the sense of globalization is good culturally speaking, but also obviously economically speaking, in terms of market expansion. And Merkel has been making quite a similar point. I mean, and oftentimes the cosmopolitanism and the multiculturalism has served as a sort of fig leaf for these more structural reforms. Now, of course, Merkel has famously said multiculturalismus is tot or is dead, but she's also taken different positions on this, I think. She was heavily criticized for austerity policies in the early 2010s. Her reaction in the pandemic seems to be quite different. And so some people have also said, well, yes, Merkel is very stable, but she's also governed according to poll outcomes oftentimes, right? Very, very stable and very reflected in a very reflected way, much different from Gerhard Schröder in style. But there is a deeper lying issue with die Politik der Mitte, right? Everybody trying to be in the middle. And I think this is what has made it somewhat arbitrary for many people in Germany, whether the CDU or the SPD is in power doesn't seem to make much of a difference for governance in substance. And I think this is what has drained much of the vitality from the SPD in particular, because it was also always the junior partner in the Great Coalition and wasn't able to benefit really from the positive outcomes.
And Boris, as you said, the SPD might be able to regroup and strengthen some of its positions if it were in the opposition, as opposed to being in another grand coalition.
Yeah, that's true. But, if you think of Walter Borjans and Saskia Essen, which were the left-wing solution, which were sort of an insight that is quite similar to what I was trying to articulate now. And now we have Olaf Scholz as a chancellor candidate. So this division is still very deep. And I think it reflects, even though the party system is very different and the electoral system is quite different, it reflects the same cleavage that we see in the Democratic Party in the US between the left and a more center-left, moderate, so-called moderate, market-oriented course.
I completely agree with you. I've been saying for a couple of years now that there are strong parallels between the SPD and the Democratic Party in the US and how they've lost touch with trade unions, with labor, and are trying to redefine themselves. So each of the three of you has put a lot on the proverbial table. We talked about Chancellor Merkel and her legacy. We talked about what's going on within the CDU. We talked about the party landscape. Before we move on and talk about Germany's role in Europe and what this all means for Europe and for the transatlantic relationship, I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to respond to some of the things that your fellow speakers have said. Joyce, let me maybe start with you.
Sure. I learned something from both of you. Thank you so much. I want to start with Christina's point about the Merz support. Just to make sure we're clear, there's quite a difference between CDU members and CDU potential voters. And the average age of CDU members is 60, as opposed to the average age of Green Party members, which is closer to 47, 48. And so even if Merz can be elected as the candidate, I don't think he would be elected as chancellor. I think there's going to be too much sort of social pushback. The Greens are gaining new members, even if the younger CDU members seem to be more hardliner. The Greens are gaining younger members at a much faster clip. And I think that reinforces some of the things that Boris had to say as well. So I just want our audience to be clear on that. I don't think Merz is electable as a chancellor, but I didn't think Trump was electable in 2016 either. So that shows you how good I am at poll predicting. In terms of
Joyce, let me just push you on that. So are you saying you think that a green-black coalition is perhaps more likely than a black-green coalition?
I think that a green-black coalition is more likely depending on the chancellor candidate for the CDU. Which also then brings me to Boris's presentation. Habeck was here at Georgetown for a while, and I think he is very sensitive to the gap between rural and urban, the dilemmas with the lack of digitalization, the lack of infrastructure, transport infrastructure, and things like that. So I do see some potential there in kind of pulling that in. But it sounds strange, but I want to defend my girlfriend Angela Merkel with regard to the austerity policies. I think what people forget is that the first stage of the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, she had an SPD finance minister. Starting with the 2009 election, Wolfgang Schäuble in a CDU FDP government was the pusher, was the real driving force behind a lot of the austerity policies. And I'm not sure that if Merkel had still been in a grand coalition, that she would have pursued as much of a hardline course there. I agree with everything else you have to say, though, in terms of, what the sort of the dynamics are of people being kind of tired of the CDU as well after 16 years. I mean, they're tired of the SPD because the SPD seemed to spend more time complaining that Merkel was stealing their issues. And I didn't hear that same response from the Greens after Fukushima. They weren't saying so much, oh, she took our anti-nuclear energy thing. They were saying, hot dog, we're getting out of nuclear energy. So I think that the Greens have developed a much more pragmatic approach now that they've been around for at least 30 years, or 40 years actually, as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Joyce. I wanted to give you both, Christina and Boris, also a chance to respond to Joyce's points about legacy and the Merkel legacy, but also wanted to offer each of you the opportunity to weigh in on some of the things that have been mentioned so far.
Should I start, Stephen?
Sure.
Yes, well, it's true what Joyce just said. We have to differentiate between members of the CDU and voters. But I would be cautious if with Friedrich Merz, the CDU would not have a chance in the elections. I'm not so sure about this. I agree that the Greens are really becoming a political party. They are not only strong, but they're subjects. They are the subjects of the future. So everybody, of course, says, well, they are really competent in climate. Everybody nowadays talks about climate, but they were the forerunners. So I think there's also a good reason. Also, then, if we go to persons, the Greens have young persons who are really in public, they discuss, they are open. So I think they are really very strong force. But whether Friedrich Merz, you know, there is also still a strong conservative part, especially in such a critical moment now. Sometimes we think a crisis is the moment for modernization, but very often we experience that in crisis, people are going back, you know, they want to have stabilized and so on. So I'm not so sure whether with Friedrich Merz, the CDU would not have a chance in the elections. Boris has already mentioned that he says, well, even if Friedrich Merz would be chairing the CDU, then there would also be a black-green coalition. So he had just to accept this because this will be the real reality. But I think it would be very difficult. If you see how they debate, if you take one of the chairs of the Green parties, Annalena Baerbock, just in a debate with Friedrich Merz, you would see Friedrich Merz smiling all the time, you know, quite arrogantly listening to what she was saying, and sort of you could not have the idea that they would cooperate. I think it would be from the topics, from the policies, really difficult. It would also be from the persons very difficult. So I think this would be a difficult situation. And of course, if the CDU goes in a more conservative direction again, it would be a chance to say for the Social Democrats to have their position again. But can this be really the future of Germany? So I would doubt that we need a conservative CDU with Friedrich Merz to bring the Social Democrats. So the Social Democrats have to find their way, how they answer the new challenges, not just because the CDU is now becoming more conservative. So I think this is going really on this conservative track. This would, I think it's not improbable, well, I think it would be a bad direction for Germany just now if this would be the direction we are going.
And Boris, over to you.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, people normally speak more of polarization in the US context, but what we've seen in the last elections in Germany and in other European states is that it takes very long to build coalitions. So there seems to be a similar phenomenon going on that expresses itself differently in the German context. So I think that might well happen. I mean, this is what happened the last time with all the discussions about Jamaica and all the different possibilities for coalitions. Yeah, maybe just 2.5 points. 1 point, yes, about the Green Party is one thing we don't talk about as much anymore because they seem to be so successful right now, is that they're quite split in the middle. I mean, there's a very progressive arm of the Green Party that is much closer to the SPD, even to the Linke maybe. I mean, the roots of the Green Party are in the außerparlamentarische Opposition, right, and the extreme left. So there are still remnants of that. But then again, there's a very liberal arm as well, which sometimes is almost synonymous in its position with the FDP. And I think these cleavages could become more pronounced the more we approach the election itself. I thought that Joyce's point on the transformative nature of Merkel was interesting, because what you emphasized was that she deprovincialized German politics. And that's really true. I mean, she is perceived as a strong international leader in a way that chancellors before her weren't. And it struck me that this didn't strike me before. I think this maybe, the transatlantic gaze might add something to this to this observation, because this is not the way that she's being discussed about right now much. So I found that striking. The other point I was wondering when Christine was talking about the different candidates, that you didn't mention Markus Söder, because I mean, he himself at least seems to be thinking that he has good chances of becoming a chancellor candidate, right? So I was wondering what your thoughts were on Söder. And he is very close to the Greens. I mean, he's basically copied all the Green Party program for the Bavarian elections. So I don't know what your position would be on that.
Well, of course, Markus Söder would not be elected at the CDU party conference.
Right,
but,
that's true. That is true.
He could be a candidate of the CDU-CSU, depending on how things play out. And so that is a question that I had as well. Christina, is that something that you would like to speak to? The likelihood of Markus Söder as the next Bundeskanzler?
Well, then we have to integrate also the three candidates now for the chair, because if Friedrich Merz is the chair, will be elected by the party members as the chair, he would not like to cooperate with Markus Söder. He would like to be the chancellor candidate himself. So the same for Laschet. Laschet would not want to be the chair of the CDU and then accept not to be the candidate for chancellor. The most probable who would accept this is Norbert Roettgen, who would perhaps accept to cooperate here. I don't know. Well, at the moment, it's whether this will really Markus Söder. Let's say this is really next year. This will depend how in January the CDU will decide who will be the chair. I think this will be decisive. And many, of course, now say that Markus Söder will be the one, but I don't think that this is, it's very much discussed. But if it's really a reality, this is still, Bavaria is one country, you know, and he is very well famous there, and you know, he is successful. But Germany and Bavaria are very difficult things. You know, federalism is important, and Bavaria always had a special position within federalism. And it never worked out when they planned from Bavaria, you know, to become on the level of the chancellor. So also in this case, even if many people now think that this will probably happen, that then we don't have the three, but suddenly another person, Markus Söder, will be the candidate for chancellor, I doubt it. I don't think it's, like Joyce has said, then we also have to think, the voters of all Germany, you know, it's then not just Bavaria. And also in the pandemic, in the beginning, they all thought he made a very good policy, but he did a lot of mistakes also. And he was always the forerunner of all the actions. And then in the end, the implementation of the actions in Bavaria were not so good. So I think he was not so successful as we always think he has been in the pandemic, and he has profited perhaps from this. I am not convinced about this.
Thank you. So I'd like to maybe fold in two viewer questions that are different but somehow related before we go on to talk about the international implications of the change in leadership. One of our viewers would like to know to what extent identity politics will help determine who is the next Bundeskanzler. And another viewer wants to know how the German party system could attract more participation from people with so-called Migrationshintergrund to reflect diversity in German society more comprehensively. Do any of you have any thoughts on sort of the changing fabric of society and how that is impacting politics in Germany right now? Boris, you're nodding your head because each of you. So who wants to go first?
Boris.
No, you go ahead. I mean, you had your hands up. I was just nodding.
You waved your hand first.
This is important, but you go ahead, please.
Well, I was going to speak more to the migration issue, the people with Migrationshintergrund. I think one of the most fundamental changes was clearly the change in the citizenship law, but more importantly, in 2014, doing away with that stupid Optionspflicht, where these young kids were given German citizenship and then were supposed to decide between 18 and 23 which citizenship they were going to keep, and they had to get all kinds of complicated papers and stuff. Generationally speaking, we're beyond that now. That a lot of these people who were given citizenship born as of 1991, all right, so they're already of voting age. We're seeing a lot more participation in the Bundestag, people of migration background. And we know that these things take the span of a generation, roughly 20 years, to be treated as normal by most other people in society. Clearly, we will always have fringe elements in this society as well as in the German society, but luckily your people can't get guns the way our people can get guns in the right-wing fringe. And I just think that the generational change has already taken place, where we're talking about the next baby boomlet, so to speak. So I think in 10 years, we won't even have to talk about people with migration background. It will be a normal part of German society, this kind of diversity.
And Christina, you were raising your hand as well.
Yes, I think the important thing is that for me, I would argue that identity politics will not decide the elections. So these will be very important points to have equality between men and women, for example. Still, we tend to forget that there is a relation between these identity politics and the socioeconomic development. And also, as Boris had said, of course, Germany is not as polarized as the United States, but we also observe a big clash between, you know, getting poor people and more well-to-do people. So we also have really growing inequality in the society. And the more we have this growing economic inequality, people are not so much interested, they don't have trust in democracy anymore, and identity politics will not be the decisive question in the elections, which I think also was interesting in the United States now. We all thought that racism would be sort of one of the main, the decisive questions, but it was also the economy. So I think we should always see that identity politics are important, but we have to see the relation with this growing inequality. People, you know, who are really on the loser side of the society and they are growing, they are not so much even interested to go to vote. They abstain from voting even. And so I think this will not be the decisive question, and we should not forget always that identity politics are not just something, you know, just identities, but it has to do with the economic development of in Germany.
Thank you.
Maybe I can just add one or 2 points. I mean, the Black Lives Matter protests were very strong also in Germany, across the world. But I think Germany was quite exceptional. I think the turnout for the demonstrations and so. So there are virulent discussions about integration and inclusion. I think it's interesting that in Germany, and some journalists have commented on this, the Black Lives Matter movement translates somewhat awkwardly into the German context. I mean, of course, there is an Afro-German community, and there are very important discussions that are being led, but there's also a big Turkish community, which wasn't discussed as much in this kind of context. So these identity discussions seem to be happening mostly in the media, in the public sphere. I would agree that in politics or in the political institutions, they are not taken up as much as they should be, except I would say for the right-wing extremists, because there you have these discussions about population exchange and fears of multiculturalism, right? And Gauland speaking about how Merkel just loved the foreigners and not the native population. So identity politics is very strong on the extreme right. I think in the other political discussions among established politicians, not as much as it should be.
So Joyce, you had a two-finger.
Yes, I wanted to add to that dimension because I think that's the hidden dimension of identity politics, the East-West divide. We see the strength of the AfD in the eastern part, even though the people who are AfD voters have better health care than they had in the past, have a cleaner environment, have the freedom to travel, have freedom of expression. And Hans Vorländer and his team did the study on Pegida and came to the conclusion that even the AfD voters say, yes, my situation now is fine, but everything is going to hell in a handbasket around me. It's this sort of abstract fear that they could lose after finally kind of settling down after 30 years. And these statistics from the elite studies that say only 1.7% of all the major elite positions in German society are held by Easterners. Clearly, that's a generational phenomenon as well, because the kids who were just teenagers or grade schoolers when the wall fell, well, one of them is my 40-something dentist here in the Washington, D.C. area. So we really don't have youth resentment fueling into those identity politics, but it is still this perception among many people that they are viewed as second-class citizens. It doesn't have always to come back to Christina's point, it isn't necessarily the material reality, the economic reality. It's the perception that they could lose more or that they're falling behind faster that I think is much more important in this AfD kind of identity debate.
So certainly 31 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and 30 years after German unification, one could dedicate an entire event to talking about the Mauer im Kopf, the psychological wall that might or might not still persist, and some of the cleavages within Germany. I'd actually like to close out our time together, because we are, believe it or not, running out of time, by talking about a subject that we haven't really talked about. Boris, you said Merkel's successor has big shoes to fill, and that's absolutely right. She is an experienced world leader. She has many relationships with other heads of state, many experiences. Her successor will undoubtedly have a steep learning curve, no matter who that person is. But the new chancellor will also come into office in a different Europe. By the time the new chancellor takes his role, Brexit will be further along than it is today. There will be elections in France in 2022. And so as we wrap up our time together, I'd like each of you perhaps to talk for a minute or two about what the change in leadership means for Europe, but also for the transatlantic relationship. And maybe this time let's go in reverse order from our starting order. I'll start with you, Boris, and then Christina, and then Joyce, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this is an interesting question and one that gets often asked, how are the transatlantic relations doing? And we've been doing a lot of soul searching in the last 4 years because it was clearly not going very well. But one thing I was always trying to point out is that there are also institutions beyond political institutions that maintain, such as the Deutsches Haus, obviously, but also other exchange programs and so on that are important in maintaining that kind of a relationship. But we also have to keep in mind that the transatlantic relationship has been suffering in the even under presidents before Trump. And there's been a pivot to Asia under Obama. There's been a shift away from the transatlantic context ever since the end of the Cold War, I would say. So the transatlantic relations might regain importance rhetorically speaking, and Biden will probably cherish them more and change the tone, as many people have emphasized. But I think they might not have the same kind of relevance as they once did. And I think the German influence in these relationships was always a secondary one. I think it always depended more on the willingness of the US than of Germany. So I don't think it would make much of a difference who would really be the German chancellor for transatlantic relations. We also tend to nostalgize a little bit the relationship between Obama and Merkel. I mean, there was the Abhör-Affäre, I think in 2009 or so, pretty much in the beginning of his first term in office. And things didn't always go quite as smoothly. So yeah, I think there are these broader tectonic shifts that are going on. Decline of US hegemony, rise of China, the crisis of the international liberal order, an ideological crisis, but also an institutional crisis in international institutions. Germany is one actor among many others and might add to a certain momentum if Biden can actually produce that momentum and if the West can reorganize. But I doubt that it will be the most powerful and most important player in that debate.
Christine, what are your thoughts on succession and what it means for Europe and the transatlantic relationship?
With regard to the transatlantic relationship, I would agree with Boris. I think here the United States is the more important partner, and the atmosphere will now be better, of course, the situation after the elections in the United States. But then the problems will be the same. The situation has not changed. So I think whoever will follow Angela Merkel, there will not be such a big difference in that regard. I think the bigger change will be in the European Union. Whether the person following Angela Merkel is able to really have a leading role in the European Union. Because I think here will be a change if you really look at being the third part with United States and China. The European Union tries now sort of to get more autonomy and to get more really common policies, even if some of the member states don't cooperate. So I think here will be, Germany's role will be much more important in the European Union, especially if they cooperate with France. So we will see how this goes on. But at the moment, Macron is very interested in cooperation with Germany. And I think here will probably also be a new start. They will perhaps, there is a debate in the European Union and also in Germany that they should not just go from, you know, one policy to the next and, you know, just making a little bit here and a little bit there and fighting the crisis, but to have sort of a new reflection where European Union is going really in which direction. And if they really go on this path of a fiscal union and not just being, you know, a market, and have really a political European Union, I think the role of Germany will be important. And whoever will be following Angela Merkel, it depends if they get really, you know, if they have really put it in the center of their politics. I think this would be important. And I could imagine this with all the three. I would not say that one of the three would not be interested in strong European politics and have a good sort of good relation and, as Boris said, good tone with the United States. But this will not be the priority in the international politics, I think.
Thank you, Christina. Joyce, over to you.
Well, I agree with both of my colleagues, but I will bring in another dimension here. I can't believe I'm saying this. I have all kinds of Hundertwasser peace movement posters. They've always been part of my personal art world. I spent time in the 80s hanging out with Jo Leinen and Petra Kelly and the Misselwitzes over in Eastern Germany, all these people, an active part of the peace movement, of the anti-nuclear movement. But what strikes me the most, one of the longer lasting legacies of the Trump administration will be that the Europeans have finally figured out they need to take their own defense into their own hands. No matter what that 2% requirement might be, the United States will not play the role in NATO that it has played over the last 50 years. Germany's concept of forward nation, where it will begin to assume the so-called new responsibility. So I think we're going to see a real reshuffling of the cards in terms of what European defense strategies are, no matter who might turn out to be the future German chancellor.
Well, thank you very much. I think you've all pointed to the fact that there is a lot for us to watch over the course of the next 10 months as Germany decides who its next chancellor will be, and many factors to consider as we think about Germany's role in Europe and the future of the German-American relationship. Joyce, Christine, Boris, thank you so much for this incredibly thoughtful and nuanced and thought-provoking conversation. I've certainly enjoyed it, and now I want to hand the floor back over to Juliane.
Yes, let me second what Steve just said. Thank you so much, Christine, Joyce, Boris, Steve, and David, for all of you adding so much to our knowledge about what the future may hold. Und danke fürs aus dem Kaffeesatz lesen. I also wanted to mention, as I was listening to you, that of course Deutsches Haus at NYU will provide many more occasions to think about the upcoming elections and about the changes in Germany and in the transatlantic relationship next year. So we'll be doing a lot of election-related events, hopefully together with you in collaboration with and featuring many of you wonderful people. And unrelated to that, we are already planning an event about the Querdenker phenomenon together with Christian Martin from the Center for European and Mediterranean Studies for early February. And we're going to do an event about Naika Vorutans and Jana Hensel's book, Die Gesellschaft der Anderen, which of course refocuses on migrants and East German perspectives. And we briefly talked about it here, and we'll do that event most likely in January with Jana Hensel and Constanze Stelzenmüller. So these two events will in a way be related to what we discussed now, and today's discussion can be an auftakt to our many election-related events that we'll have coming up next year. Personally, I wonder what Angela Merkel will do with her plenty of spare time next year. I'm curious if she will really retire. I don't think she will be joining Gazprom or any other of these lovely companies. I foresee something more socially engaged. I don't see her reading on a balcony, at least not for long. But I hope she will make a good choice for the greater good, and knowing her, I think she will. But we will see. Thanks again so much. It's a pleasure to conclude this conference with this panel. And schöne Aussichten. Have a nice evening. Thank you, everybody. This was wonderful. And have a nice evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are. And thanks for joining our conference and this event. Take good care. Be well. Be safe. See you soon.